Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about instant armies and are miniatures painters at threat of becoming an endangered species. So today's video was inspired by two things. As usual, two things happening at the same time gave me a train of thought that led to this particular script. So the first was I was leafing through my usual War Games magazine, and I was looking at some of the adverts for the starter sets, the army starter sets where you get all of the figures for both sides, or a significant number of figures for both sides included, along with a starter set of rules. So there's the Napoleonics version out there, there's an American Civil War version out there, and a great way for a newbie, for instance, or someone who wants to break into a new period, could just get this box and everything they need is included. And there's certainly a market for it. That's been proven by the fact that the companies selling them are still selling them and are expanding their ranges. So there's clearly a market for that sort of thing. And then, having put the magazine down and gone back to my computer, I was looking through YouTube and I came across a video by, I think it was Must Contain Minis, had done a video on a D&D pre-painted model that he'd bought, and he was basically marvelling at the quality of the painting on this pre-painted miniature that had come in the post for him. It did get me thinking about, is there the possibility that at some point this pre-painted miniature process could be scaled up in some way so that we can end up seeing pre-painted armies starter sets for historical wargaming? It's worth starting off by saying, now I've bought some of the pre-painted D&D stuff myself many years ago. When my group met physically, face to face, we only ever play over Zoom these days. We would often have models down on the table. We would have our character models that we'd usually painted ourselves. But when I was running games, I was not above using the D&D pre-painted stuff because the quality was often basic but serviceable, and certainly good enough for models that might for monsters and characters that were perhaps only going to be one use, one encounter, and they'd spend relatively small amount of table time and weren't worth spending hours and hours painting. So give me an example, right? So we've got a troll model here, perfectly suitable for a one-off game. If I remember rightly, he did actually feature in one of my encounters. I think he was on the table for about 30 minutes. It certainly wasn't worth spending money on a metal miniature that size and hours and hours and hours painting it when it was actually on the table for about 20 minutes, and that was the only time this model was ever going to see action. I'm not above buying pre-painted models, but can that technique be transferable to mass-produced historical wargaming starter sets? Now, it worth be saying as well that these D&D models are, let's face it, they are low-cost painting, usually done in developing economies, and there's all sorts of ethical issues about the idea of using low-paid foreign workers to do this sort of this very menial work. There's nothing wrong with the quality of the work that gets produced, but there are some ethical issues to do with outsourcing that to the lowest possible bidder in some sweatshop somewhere. But that's a subject perhaps for another day. What I'm interested in is the practicality of that technique, if you like, being used for historical armies, ranks and ranks of soldiers. Certainly I think that in theory, you could replicate that process on smaller models over much larger groups of figures, but I suspect that would just multiply the cost to the point where it becomes actually too expensive to produce a painted army in a box and then replicate that thousands of times, thousands of box sets and so on. I'm not entirely sure that is actually viable. I could be wrong. I don't know enough really about that side of the industry, but I suspect that might not be viable. But what about current and emerging technologies such as colour 3D printing? So I've mentioned before that back at Salute earlier this year I saw a 3D colour printed model it was still very basic to this painter's eye. I think it only consisted of 6 colours, but actually I was quite blown away by the fact that the technology could produce this. Now, I wasn't unaware that this technology existed. I mean, there was a Kickstarter 2 or 3 years ago, Hero Forge, for a company that were going to basically, you would build the character model that you wanted, all fantasy figures for D&D and so on, and you could effectively build the various parts of the STL so that you could add a different type of head and different weapons and different types of armour, and then you decide what colour all those elements would be, skin tones, clothing, armour colour, all that sort of thing, and then Hero Forge would print that colour model for you. It's not cheap, it has to be said. I think like a basic model is $40 upwards, and I presume, because I haven't really looked into it in a great deal of detail, because it's not something I want to do, but I presume the more complex the model, the more colours you use, the more expensive the figure would be. And that reaches the point where I would rather buy and paint something myself. So it's not a technology that I would use for D&D models, for instance. But is there a potential for that technology to be developed, refined and improved to the point where it's actually possible to paint, to print whole units, ranks of soldiers, for use with large scale, big battle, historical starter sets? And the answer is probably yes, eventually, and probably not in the too distant future, I suspect. Of course, that begs the next question: is that a good thing? So as a painter, my initial reaction is obviously one of existential dread. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. Hand painting miniatures is a large part of my enjoyment of the hobby. I'm a big advocate for the craft side of our hobby. Obviously. I think it has huge mental health benefits, but also there's just something unique and quite beautiful about creating something yourself, and that is taking bare metal and turning it into a living, breathing figure with the art of our paint. And of course, we then take those skills and we make terrain, we build buildings, and all the other creative sides of the hobby that require our hands and our minds to work in unison. So I am a big advocate of that. I'm also, it has to be said, and I've mentioned it many times before, I am a bit of a leadhead. I prefer metal over plastic, and of course we're not going to see coloured metal figures coming off of 3D printers. So I'm not a huge fan of plastic or resin, although I appreciate that that's probably the way the hobby is going to go eventually, to a greater or lesser extent. I do like the heft of a metal model in my hand, it has to be said. And then of course there's the other thing, is if we stop painting miniatures entirely, will we lose a whole set of skills and the confidence to make things like terrain and so on? So the idea that we could get to a point at some point in the future, whether that's in the short term or the very long term, where 3D colour printed armies are the way of the norm. They're coming in block sets, and the other sets of units are coming out, and they're pre-coloured rather than pre-painted, perhaps I would call it. Does fill me with a certain amount of dread and a sinking of a heart. But then I am a bit of an old grognard in that respect. So then you've got to turn it on its head and say, not every wargamer enjoys painting. I've said this before in some of my videos. And for some newbies to the hobby, painting armies, even painting individual figures, can be incredibly intimidating. The natural alternative for them is to go for skirmish games with fewer models and so on, and perhaps a lower bar to entry, both financially and technically, in terms of painting skill and so on. But I don't want to see a future where big battles aren't played. So I would like, if we're going to go down the route of introducing pre-coloured models, I would like eventually to see actual big units for big battles to be the end goal of this, because if new gamers are being put off from entering because of the skill required, then maybe pre-coloured starter sets along the lines of the army boxes that we're seeing already, maybe is a way of getting them into the hobby. Of course, it has to be said that obviously, many wargamers already pay commissions to get models painted for them, although that, my impression is, I've never done that myself, it has to be said, but my impression is that that's quite an expensive way of building up an army. And then of course you've got other options like eBay and so on, and bring and buys, where you can occasionally find a bargain and buy an army, a pre-loved army, and get it back on the table. And then, there's certainly I hope there's going to be a continued market for that sort of thing, and maybe that's a way to encourage new gamers to get into the hobby. Go and buy yourself a pre-painted army that way. But then of course you've also got a situation where you're going to have older wargamers who maybe for one reason or another, health issues and various other factors, may decide that they can't paint anymore, having pre-coloured models in starter sets may be an option for them, some way for them to continue to increase their collections, play new games with nice coloured miniatures, maybe. If they can get over the shock of the new technology, then maybe that's an option for them. There's certainly lots of potential for existing wargamers who may consider this technology groundbreaking. So as usual, I'm going to ask what you think about the prospect of fully painted or fully coloured box sets for historical wargaming. Is this going to be the death knell of painting, or do you think it represents a potential lowering of the barrier entry to new wargamers? I'm not, as I've said on many occasions, and I've done plenty of videos about this, I'm not an expert on the subject of 3D printing. I can't see myself going down that route, certainly not while I'm crammed in this tiny little room. But maybe you already 3D print, or have even have some knowledge of colour printing technology, and where it's potentially going. If like me, you may just have an opinion on the subject and wish to share it. As always, I'd love to hear your experiences and your opinions in the comments below. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video and found it interesting, and if you did, please like, subscribe and share. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with my videos, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, look after yourself, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.